So welcome to this latest in No Silver Bullet webinars. I'm Steve Hearson, I'm your host, and I'm joined by Martin Parker. I will explain to you shortly the format of the day. So let us just begin, however, by doing a wee bit of contracting and setting the scene. So, in terms of working together today, we are going to keep it as relaxed as we can, but with some structure. So by all means, keep your video on, but turn off other apps and notifications where you can. If there's noise like animals, children, builders, whatever else going on in the background, just mute as you need to. You're going to get a chance to have some conversations with each other, and there'll also be some opportunities to ask questions of Martin and myself. So we encourage you to be honest. And Martin and myself are used to conversations around this kind of subject in our respective worlds being actually quite, what's the word? People have some distinct positions. So even if you disagree, be respectful of some of those differences. Be curious and seek to understand what might be behind some of those positions. In terms of the technology, we are obviously using Zoom. I'm trusting that after 18 plus months of COVID, the Zoom virgins are few and far between. If you need any help with Zoom, just shout. We are also going to be using Mentimeter, which I shall come to shortly. So if you could go to menti.com, I will give you the code for a wee bit of interactivity that we're going to have in a moment. In terms of myself, I will keep this fairly brief. I'm a consultant, a facilitator and a coach. The guise I'm in here, I think most specifically, however, is I'm researching and writing a book which is on the theme of silver bullets and the idea that they don't exist for complex challenges in organisations, and that there is in effect a functional collusion that goes on between leaders and organisations and a number of other parties who collude with the idea that there is such a thing as a silver bullet. There are certain solutions, and those parties include business schools, large consultancies, small consultancies, individual consultants such as myself, theorists, gurus, people who are selling methodologies that offer certainty that if you use that methodology then everything will be fine. Fields of practice such as organisational development and change in HR are also often prone to offering a certainty that if you go along with their recommendations and prescriptions then things will be fine. So the book is in that area. There are also, and I will include details when I send out details of the recording, there are chapters available for you to read, early chapters and drafts. So I'll make those available to you as well. Martin?
Hello there. Yeah. Hiya. So thanks everyone for pitching up. That's really nice to see you all. I'm a professor at the University of Bristol in the School of Management. And I am also the lead for a thing called the Inclusive Economy Initiative, which is an attempt to build networks between the university and a whole series of activists across the city. My background's really in sociology, anthropology, cultural studies, things like that. And I came to working in a school of management after working in a sociology department for a long time. So I guess I drag a lot of that baggage with me. And in the, whatever it is now, 20, 25 years or so that I've been working in business and management, I've been a kind of a grumpy critic of the hand that feeds me. Culminating in a particularly grumpy and bad-tempered book called "Shut Down the Business School" from a couple of years ago, which kind of forms the sort of the structure of some of the complaints and suggestions I'll be making. But that'll probably do, I think, won't it, Steve? Is that enough?
That's absolutely fine.
Fine.
By way of just whilst we're a big group, it would be lovely if in the chat, if you'd be willing, just to put into the chat. I think this morning we'll go for, where are you located today? And maybe also, what one thing can you see maybe out the window that's catching your eye this morning? Something that's catching your eye as you look around you.
Might be something quite alarming.
Yeah. Be nice just to get a bit of humanity from our audience today.
Huh.
Men on a roof.
Oh. Maples, nice.
The whole of Australia out of your window. Marvellous. I'm loving it. Hong Kong. Lovely, Thomas. Thank you. Anything in particular in Hong Kong? That's the question.
There is sun in Sweden. Wow. There's a
Thanks,
thing.
Thomas. So lovely to have you here. So I'm now going to invite you to go to menti.com, and you can always scan the code that you can see on your screen. But if you go to menti.com and enter that code, you will see in a moment there is a question for you, which is, where is my, right. And now it is not allowing me to move on, which is interesting. Okay.
The best laid plans of mice and men.
Oh, joy, isn't it, when it decides that it's not.
Are you okay, sir?
Hold on a minute. Let me just. Right, let's try again, shall we? There we go. So, first question. Right at the beginning of this conversation, without having heard anything from Martin or myself, the proposition, business schools should be shut down and replaced with something else. It's a fairly binary question, and there you have three choices.
Oh, I've got some good undecideds to work with. Okay.
Just so you know, you will be asked this question again at the end of the session. So we'll get a sense of whether or not, Martin, you have made
whether I have the arts of persuasion, or whether I've made the case for keeping business schools.
Exactly.
And kicking people like me out.
Yeah. So I think we can see the pattern there. By all means, keep voting in the background. I think we've got enough data to see what the pattern is. That's just a wee bit of data collection to get us going. So back to what we're going to do today. I'm going to give you the outline of the session. This is the plan. I'm going to frame very briefly for you how I got to the point where I've invited Martin along to talk to me today. And then myself and Martin will begin the first inquiry, and I'll have a conversation with Martin about the proposition of why we should shut down the business schools. At the end of that, we'll have a Q&A before we move into the second conversation, the second inquiry, which will be what we need to replace business schools with. Then all into small groups to give you a chance to chew on what it is that you've heard before we come back for a final. If somebody's, I can hear somebody having a conversation, so if you go on mute, that would be great. So that's the menu. In terms of how we got to this point, I've already said briefly what I'm writing about, but the bottom line is this. If you do a search on Google, you will find many references to the idea that there is a silver bullet or there is no silver bullet for something. It's part of our common language and our vernacular. And in the work I do in organisational consulting and in change, there is definitely a pattern that I noticed in the last few years of organisations looking to manage their anxiety by finding something that will give them certainty that there is a solution to a complex problem. And let's be clear here, there's a distinction here between a complicated problem, my server is broken, I need to fix it or replace it, and something that's complex, which has got many moving parts and which is changing moment by moment, which often involves human beings. Through the conversations I've had and through my own experiences, I stumbled across Martin's name, first of all, in a Guardian article. And there were a number of things in it which caught my attention. And this was one thing that caught my attention. I won't read it verbatim because you're all big enough and old enough to read. So I'll just allow you to read that for a moment. So in that was a number of things that really grabbed me. So having read the article, I bought Martin's book and then hunted him down at Bristol. And when I flushed him out, he said after a conversation, he would be happy to come and have a chat today. And that's what we're going to do now. We're going to have a conversation about why we need to shut down the business schools. So, Martin, let's begin our first conversation. And I guess the obvious place to start is, given the fact that you've put out the proposal in effect in the book and
Mm.
beyond that, why shut down the business schools?
I guess it starts off with the assumption that capitalism isn't working. Yeah, so that's the kind of the first principle in a sense. I think we can argue, well, I will argue that climate change, massive, gigantic global inequalities and exclusions suggest that we do not have the best economic system, the best forms of organization, and that we can do something a bit better. So we have to start off with that kind of diagnosis that there's a problem. But then if we look at if you like, the causes of that problem, there's a whole series, obviously, but one of them, I think, is the global business school. So business schools are big business. There are something like, when I was trying to do the sums back in 2018, 13,000 business schools globally, with an fee income of something like $400 billion. This is a gigantic global system. In the UK, something like 1 in 7 students are studying some version of business. It's by far the biggest subject. That includes, subjects like accounting and marketing and so on. And if you look at the figures globally, it varies depending on different nation states, but it's between 1 in 3 and 1 in 4, something like that. So it's, this is a gigantic set of ideas that's being propagated. And my fundamental conviction is that the majority of the stuff that's getting taught is essentially reproducing the status quo. Yeah, that we have this enormous system of kind of reproducing particular forms of common sense, and that those forms of common sense are profoundly damaging to people and planet. So that's the kind of summary of why I think they need to be changed.
And one of the things that interests me is, and I shared this with you before we came online this morning, in conversations I've had with people recently at universities, when I raise this argument and when I've talked about your work and our conversations, there's a kind of defensiveness that seems to kick in. And it seems to kick in around particularly the business school, but people seem to have less of a problem challenging the idea of the MBA. So MBAs seem to be fair game, but business schools are not. So I was
Yeah.
curious on your view on that.
Yeah. I mean, and I'm sure this is a theme that's going to recur in the conversation today. And that's the question is kind of how radical do you want to be? Do you want to reform existing business schools, or do you want to talk about teaching a different form, a different way of thinking about organization and exchange? The MBA criticism is, after all, a relatively old one. And one that can come from some fairly conventional places. That, the classic example of that would be somebody like Mintzberg, for example, Managers Not MBAs, which is, a perfectly good book. And it's a book that essentially argues that the business school needs to teach practice rather than theory. But it's not an attack on the business school. It's essentially a reformist argument that suggests that the business school should be doing something slightly differently. You get very similar kinds of arguments, I think, and they're often quite defensive ones when people argue that, but we're teaching about diversity, or we do have modules on carbon reduction, or we've got a module on corporate social responsibility, all this kind of stuff. That it's a kind of a sort of defensive decoration, in a sense. It's a way of saying that we are doing these things, we're changing, that kind of stuff. I just don't think that this is radicalism worthy of the name. It's essentially a way of allowing business as usual to continue, but without any substantial changes in the way that the business school imagines itself.
Okay. The last webinars I ran were with Dr. Wendy Shepherd from Cranfield, who's really interesting in terms of research she's done. Her PhD was actually into the value and impact of executive education interventions.
Okay.
And one of the things she talked about was that as she started talking about her research, how much defensiveness and how much anxiety there was around actually having that conversation. And I actually had a conversation with her on one of these calls, one of these sessions, where I said, there is a proposition that all business schools fundamentally are teaching things that come from a very narrow set of assumptions about the nature of organising. Now, she pushed back on that and made the point that, for example, at Cranfield, they actually do many different things, and there's different ways of doing things. And when I think about, I'm on faculty for the new masters in OD and change that is being run out of Chichester with Maven.
Right.
So I'm part of that universe as well,
Mm.
and that masters is actually very different to many of the things that are out there. So I guess my question is, there is stuff that is different.
Mm.
Is your contention that as a set of institutions, it is now so far gone as a phenomenon that business schools have to go, even though there may be localized some really useful work?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I guess that would be a summary. Let me just sort of rehearse that a bit more. So, very often when I'm presenting this kind of work, I'm met with a kind of "but we do X" sort of response. And certainly, that's true. I mean, I and a whole series of people like me are examples of dissent within business schools, attempts to teach and research in different sorts of ways, and so on. But that's not a terribly good sampling strategy. 95% of the business schools in the world, 95% of the time, teach conventional forms of pro-managerial market capitalism, and they reproduce that in a pretty unthinking way, particularly I think in areas like marketing, finance, accounting, strategy, some of the kind of core parts of the business school curriculum. Most of the alternative-y stuff, if you like, comes out of some bits of organization studies, people and organization kind of things. That's where, if you like, critical management has its biggest strength. The problem for me is that attempts at reform, which kind of build on, if you like, this sort of idea that we're doing it already, are simply not radical enough to deal with the nature of the challenges that we face. Because I think so many of the core assumptions built into business school research and teaching.
He's frozen. This is that moment where I wish I had hold music.
The business school police, Steve.
I think it is Adrian. Yes, somebody's out there. They've pulled the plug on Martin. You're back, Martin. Oh, no, hang on. We haven't got your... So, keep talking.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. That was probably some dark forces trying to silence me, I would imagine. Yeah, probably the CIA or something like that. Where was I up to before I stopped?
Oh, God, I was distracted by you being cut off.
Was anyone listening?
Yeah, I was.
You were talking about how their reforms were not as radical as they could be.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so that's pretty close to the end. Thanks, Rachel. Thank you very much. And 10 points for actually remembering where I was. So yes, the forms of reformism I just don't think are sufficiently radical to deal with the kind of challenges that we face, and that really business schools now, or as I suggest, my alternative is a school for organizing. That schools for organizing need to be engaged in how do we produce a different kind of economy, and that means thinking about so many of our assumptions about the competitive advantage of nations, about hierarchy within organizations, about ownership and control and carbon and inclusion and diversity. All this kind of stuff needs to change. It's a kind of a root and branch radicalism that's required, not just claiming that we teach CSR.
Brilliant. We're going to come on to a school for organising in a bit. One of the threads I wanted to pull on from the book is you talk quite extensively about certainty and about the certainty that seems to pervade business schools, both in terms of how they physically manifest. So your lovely description of, all the entrances are the same. There's always a screen. There's a receptionist. There'll be papers there. There'll be the list of all the courses you can do. There's certainly a number of symbols, and that all offer a kind of a reassuring certainty that this is a place that can give you what you need, but also the certainty of what is taught in those programs. If you learn this, then you will. If you do this program at this school, then you will connect to a network of people. You will earn so much money. So I was interested in your view of the way in which certainty permeates this universe.
Yeah, that's really interesting, actually, isn't it? I hadn't thought about it in quite that way, Stephen. That's a really helpful reflection. I guess that in a sense, in order to understand why this is the case, we need to go back to why business schools exist. Yeah. So, in the UK, I realize not all of you are in the UK, but in the UK, business schools are the cash cows of the contemporary university. They're growing rapidly in order to subsidize a whole series of other things that are happening within UK universities, which are effectively getting privatized by the back door. Across the world, that's more or less true depending on the national context. But the key issue is this is a form of knowledge that's being sold for money. Yeah. And in order to do that, I guess you have to make hyperbolic claims about it, don't you? You need to claim that if
do you mind to go inside that? Follow that car, please.
It's whoever's on the iPhone. Whoever's on the iPhone, could you mute?
I've muted it.
That's great. Thank you very much. You have to make hyperbolic claims about what the form of knowledge you're selling can do. So that means that very often, university marketing departments are involved with these kind of essentially fairy dust claims about how much you'll be able to earn, or what kind of person you'll be, or whatever it might be, after you've done this particular kind of course. And given our reliance in the UK on students from overseas, particularly China and India, that then becomes a gigantic marketing exercise in the selling of fairy dust, doesn't it? And the fairy dust needs to give you something. You can't just say, something a bit sort of conditional. It might. It could. You have to say it will. Yeah, you have to claim that, and that means that I think the reproduction of the status quo then is given a new, almost kind of market imperative. It's almost like it's not just about ideology; it's also about selling something that will sell. And there's a huge fear, and I've been involved in these kind of discussions with university marketing departments on various occasions. There's this huge fear of being different. Because if you're different, it means that somehow you're outside the mainstream and that you won't sell in quite the same kind of way. So even though virtually every university business school claims it's doing something special, Bristol's doing precisely the same. I'm sure Liverpool's doing the same, and Sussex is doing the same. They're saying they're doing something different. In fact, they're just like penguins huddling together. They are radically the same rather than different.
So just to I guess put some flesh on this idea of just how much business schools now represent by way of income. One organisation in the sector I know, when I was talking to my client there, I think their business school represents around 24 or 25% of the income for that institute.
Wow.
So from the outside, my assumption therefore is if 25% or near enough a fifth or a quarter of your revenue is from one source, doing anything that risks that revenue stream is going to be unthinkable and undiscussable.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's right. The institution that I work in, University of Bristol, has not had any particular investment in business and management education for the longest time, and it's probably the last of the kind of the elite Russell Group universities to get itself a business school. But it's fairly clear what the economics of that involve, because we've got big science departments, and things like vet schools and dentistry schools and things like that routinely hemorrhage money. So having a business school then becomes really important to be generating unencumbered cash, because after all, the vast majority of the undergraduate fee income, for example, is being spent on teaching undergraduates. The postgraduate income that business schools bring in is unencumbered cash that can be spent on things like subsidizing science departments or whatever, but also building shiny new buildings and so on. And universities, I think, are now in the UK, and again, I'm not saying this is the case everywhere, but are into a kind of a sort of a cycle of needing new income in order to engage in new projects, which then they're hoping will allow them to generate new income and so on. So effectively, they're on a kind of merry-go-round. But yeah, the reliance. I remember when I was at Leicester years ago, talking to one of the PVC's pro-vice chancellors there about just how reliant Leicester was on its then School of Management. And he was just saying, this is kind of crazy. If you're a business and you were this reliant on one of your product lines, you would try to diversify. Yeah. And effectively, it's even worse than that, because effectively the real profit margin is in Chinese postgraduate students. Yeah, that's what we've been mainlining on in UK higher education for the last 2 decades.
So we're going to move to the Q&A shortly for this phase. And one more thing I just wanted to I guess bring out in the open So when I found your book and I found it on Amazon, and I was curious to read the reviews, and it was kind of what I expected I'd see, which was one or two people um, effectively discounting your argument by putting it in the box marked, Marxist critique. Because it comes from that position, ergo, it means you are a particular type of thinker, and therefore the arguments within the book are not valid.
Yeah.
And I actually did put a review on there.
Oh, thank you, Steve.
Which offered a slightly different perspective, because to me,
Thank you.
that's a you can pay me later, Martin. That's a kind of a binary type of thinking that frustrates me. It's not about whether or not I agree with something. It's can I hold the contradiction, and that I may disagree, for example, with Marxism, but actually the argument that somebody's making, which might even come from that perspective, actually there's some good stuff in there. So I guess my question that's lurking in this is, to what extent do you find that because you're coming from a position of the capitalist system is not working, market managerialism is the dominant mode of organising that is taught, that your thinking is dismissed because you are easily labelled as a particular type of thinker?
Yeah. I think that's probably about right. So I seem to have either people kind of feel like radically agree with me, and I see them nodding and clapping, as if I'm kind of expressing something that they also feel, or I'm kind of discounted. There was a very interesting experience I had just after the book had been published, and I was doing some kind of presentation to, I think it was an Association of Business Schools event, and there were a whole bunch of business school deans there, and I'd been kind of invited along to be the court jester, I think. And it was fairly clear that in a sense, the point of the event was to demonstrate that my analysis was wrong, by saying, well, we were doing all this kind of stuff anyway. But also kind of underneath that was a sense in which I suppose that I feel I'm sometimes used as almost like a symbol of the tolerance and heterodoxy of the business school. Yeah. So the fact that somebody like me exists is then used as a kind of proof that business schools aren't that bad. Yeah. But that's actually quite dangerous, isn't it? So, if my critique means anything, if the kinds of things I mean anything, it's really about radical changes to the way in which we imagine business schools, and their relationships to universities and a whole bunch of other stuff. So the idea that critique could be somehow discounted, either by pointing to me as somebody with free speech who's expressing radical views, or just saying I'm a kind of loony Marxist who doesn't like capitalism, it's really not very helpful. And I doubled down on that at the moment. Well, for fairly obvious reasons. It seems to me demonstrably bleeding obvious. You don't need to be a Marxist to say that capitalism isn't working. Yeah, if we're going to keep this planet habitable for a large number of human beings, then capitalism needs to change. Simple as that.
On that, what's the word? Unopinionated note, we will pause and just let's have a few questions before we move on to Zena. So either wave at me on the screen or use the raise hand thing in Zoom, and I'll do my best to farm it. Zena, you got your hand up first.
Yes, I mean, I've worked at business school, worked at Cranfield, but I don't anymore. But I'm really interested in. I've never asked this question even to myself. Who founded business schools? Who was the person who founded it, and where was it founded?
Yeah, there's a bit about this in one of the chapters of the book where I kind of try and track down the history of business schools a bit more. The earliest business schools, recognizable things called business schools, are mostly in Northwest Europe in the beginning of the 19th century, and they're mostly teaching things like accounting, schools of accounting. But those usually get discounted in the sort of the history of business schools, because the usual story is that it's places like Wharton and Harvard in America in the 1870s. But they're actually, there's some really interesting books on the history of business schools. And one of the things that's very often remarked is that early American business schools were really attempts at a kind of a sort of moral education as much as a technical education. Remember, this is just, the beginnings of the Gilded Age, in a sense of a kind of critique, a popular critique of business, of inequality, and so on. And so those business schools from the kind of 1870s, 1880s are very often places that are teaching a particular kind of, if you like, a rather moralizing curriculum, an attempt to say that business people have certain kinds of responsibilities to the rest of society. And that as a result, they need a kind of professional education in order to make sure that they carry out those responsibilities in an appropriate way. The swing to the much more technocratic business school is usually dated in the States from something like the 60s and 70s. So that, the dominance of finance, the Chicago boys, all that kind of stuff. So there's different kind of iterations, Ina, I think, before we get to our version of the school.
But it's really interesting that from what you're saying, then it was actually based on something from a moral standing point in terms of responsibility.
In the US, yes, it does seem to have been. Yeah, this is based on my reading of a series of histories of business schools, but at least 3 of those argue that places like Harvard, Wharton, Penn, and others were kind of centrally concerned with a kind of moral education, if you like, the sort of the professional responsibilities of managers. And I suppose that fits quite nicely in terms of the growth of large organizations in early capitalism and so on, but also the beginnings of the kind of concentration that leads to, the kind of the robber barons of the late 19th, early 20th century.
Yeah, the other bit that feeds in there is scientific management, and Frederick Taylor had a huge influence earlier on. Which is ironic given the fact there is very little evidence for Frederick Taylor's work from an evidentiary basis. Was my understanding. But he had a huge influence on business schools. We've got a couple of questions in. Is there anything else there, because we've got a couple of questions in the chat.
No, I'll let you carry on.
Brilliant. So one from Adrian. Wondering whether the problem is much wider than business schools and is actually true of the whole education system. Well, as a parent of a 14-year-old, I'd say yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, one of the projects I've often thought I'd like to get involved in is how you might redesign O-level and A-level business studies in order to reflect the kinds of things I want to say, because it does seem to me that if we're going to deal with the kind of crises that we're facing right now, then we need a much more radical form of imagination. So a lot of the kind of the core elements of business school common sense, which are prefigured, I think, in O-level and A-level education, really do need to alter, even down to kind of, some core stuff about, say, I mentioned it before, but the competitive advantage of nations, for example. So this is now this is kind of a routine way of thinking about why international trade happens. International trade is highly carbon expensive. The reason, or basically the reason Amazon.
Oh, Martin, you're on mute.
Okay.
There we go.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Now.
All right. I actually cunningly trod on part of the microphone. That was clever of me, wasn't it? Okay. So once again, I forgot where I was.
The international trade and carbon.
That's right. Competitive advantages of nations. That's right. So we need to assume a more localized economy, for example. We can't simply and this goes back to global Britain in some senses, doesn't it? We can't simply assume that we can move stuff around the world in the way that we do currently without there being carbon costs involved. And that means that things like international business, for example, really need to be radically rethought.
Question from Lisa in the chat. Curious about internal business / leadership programs inside orgs. General Electric, for instance, started by Jack Welch to propagate not just capitalism and status quo ideas, but also our brand of these ideas. Thoughts?
Yeah, I guess, Lisa, are you sort of thinking about sort of internal sort of corporate culture, if you like, there, about the idea of sort of generating a certain sort of consensus or something like that, or seemed consensus? Is that what you're thinking about?
Yeah, and where I'm coming from is I worked in healthcare in Canada for many years, and our team of leadership were constantly sent to the Rotman School of Management to learn how to be better leaders in healthcare. And meanwhile, we're taught stories about war and, giving speeches, and they had nothing to do with working in a high pressure environment where people's lives are at stake. And so the idea was always that the university could teach us what living in the hospital couldn't. So I'm curious around how organizations create programs or send a special cohort into these programs in order to develop, so-called leadership skills.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? So there's this sort of idea that the university knows something that you don't know. So, and I suppose, again, going back to the idea that you're selling a product, then you need to claim that you have a particular kind of mystery that you will release in return for some cash. So that kind of makes sense in terms of the market relation there. Whether that's true or not is a much more moot point. I mean, I think that there is an argument to be made here that in fact, management isn't something which is a generalizable skill. Management or leadership isn't something which is a generalizable skill, and it might have very variable instantiations, understandings, depending on the kind of sector you're working in. I remember from quite a few years ago, an ex-colleague of mine who had a background in engineering talking about the importance of managers and engineering firms understanding engineering. Yeah, in other words, they couldn't just do the MBA or do some management qualification and then assume that talking bullshit about leadership was somehow going to impress the engineers. They needed to be able to speak engineering in order to do that. Now, I assume, Lisa, that there's a similar kind of problem here, that in terms of healthcare, people need to understand the particularities of healthcare in order to manage a healthcare organization. And some general purpose notion of what management is won't really cut the mustard.
Lovely. So I'm going
Thanks,
to
Martin.
suggest
Okay.
we move on to our second conversation now, Martin, namely the School for Organising. And I had to go with a beaver. I needed a furry animal that is very good at organising.
Do they sit on their tail like that, or is
They
it on
do.
They do.
They do. Yeah.
Looks like he's on a surfboard.
Yeah. Well, they're amongst the greatest surfers in the natural world, obviously.
Yes.
So we're going to
fantastic.
We're going to move to the nature of organising,
Okay.
and I guess here, in the book, you're really clear. You set out the arguments for why there's a case for closing business schools, and you've explained that now, and you have an answer. Your answer is you close them down and you replace them with schools for organising. So what is a school for organising?
School for Organising, yeah. So the first sort of five chapters of the book are the kind of the grumpy diagnosis of the problem, and then the second 5 chapters are where we move to the sunlit uplands of my solution. What I propose is essentially that we need to move away from the idea of management and towards the idea of organising. And essentially, the kind of the underlying narrative there is that organising is actually the problem we're looking at. Organising in terms of the production of patterns of exchange, of relationships between people and things. Okay, that's what organizations do. Management, as it's currently understood and practiced, is a very particular form of organization that relies on assumptions about hierarchy, on assumptions about certain kinds of people having certain kinds of knowledge that other people don't have, and that those special people, the coordinators, the managers, should be rewarded more highly than the other people who don't have the knowledge that the special managers have. And of course, that sort of plays into the notion that these people would have special kinds of qualifications, certain kinds of skills, and so on. So it seems, to me, profoundly anti-democratic, if you like. In addition, I think we need to acknowledge that management, as it's currently understood, is primarily a phenomenon that's associated with the management of markets. In other words, either marketizing public sector organizations or the idea that markets are the best ways to solve all sorts of problems, and consequently, you need people who understand those markets in order to address those problems. So, I think all of that stuff needs to be bracketed, and instead we address the problem of organization. How do we organize? Yeah, that's a much more, if you like, generous way of framing the problem. So in that sense, management then becomes a specific form of organization, but not the only one. There are lots of other organizational forms: cooperatives, mutuals, local exchange trading systems, zakat, various kinds of intentional communities, or different ways of thinking about ownership structures, like employee ownership trusts or community land trusts or whatever else. There are lots of other ways of thinking about how we can structure businesses and engage in exchange. And many of these are actually existing forms. You know, probably the most prominent one would be the cooperative form, for example. This is an organizational form that's existed in the UK, named in the UK for at least 200 years. There are something like 7,000 organisations now that belong to Cooperatives UK. Many of them are very long-standing and profitable businesses, and they're cooperatively owned, owned by the people who work for them. There's a whole variety of different ways of thinking about how co-ops might be important in terms of addressing the kind of challenges we face. But if you go to most business schools, you will not be exposed to ideas about co-ops. Yeah, it's simply not the case. A friend of mine from Bristol sold his organization, a financial consultancy, into an employee ownership trust, which is a kind of, it's not a co-op, but it's an organization a bit like John Lewis. It's held in trust on behalf of the employees. And he was taking his daughter, I think it was, around various business schools a couple of years ago, and went up to the University of Edinburgh, and Chris, for that is his name, was asking the poor sap sitting on the welcome desk at the University of Edinburgh whether they taught about employee ownership. And the poor person said something like, "I don't think so." And then Chris got completely mad. He was just insanely furious with the idea that why, if you're teaching about business, wouldn't you teach about employee ownership? No? That is a recognizable, long-standing form of business organization. So teach about that. More generally, then, that's just one example, I think, of lots of different organizational forms that could be taught about within the School for Organising. And just to kind of almost kind of prefigure, I think, probably later bits of the conversation, I assume that what we're doing when we engage in teaching and research within the School of Organising is not assuming that we know the answer. It's an experimental science. Yeah. In other words, we don't think we already know what management should be doing, what the best way is, or how to market, or what a strategy should be. Instead, we're trying to find solutions to particular kinds of problems. So in that sense, it both seems kind of almost a more kind of scientific practice, rather than assuming we've already got the answers, but also a more modest one. And perhaps that speaks to your question about certainty, Steve.
Well, that links to something that I shared with you before we started the session today. I was talking to David Wilkinson at the Oxford Review, I think it was earlier this week or last week, and some of his earlier research a few years ago showed that only 2% of managers and organisations have the capability or capacity for paradoxical thinking, that they can't hold both and. To some extent, that fits with my own experience. And then if we connect that to what business schools arguably currently do and what you're suggesting, the business school fits with the 98% that want certainty. The School for Organising is a place for paradoxical thinking and working with tensions.
Yes, I guess. I mean, we could express it like that. I mean, I think I wouldn't want that sort of finding to suggest that I think that, the vast majority of managers are stupid or evil or something like that. I think they're placed in situations in which a kind of false certainty is demanded of them. And as anybody who's worked in a large organization knows, your job is very often an uncomfortable box that shapes the way that you think in all sorts of ways. So certainly we need to encourage organizations that are much more tolerant of ambiguity and paradox and all that kind of stuff. I think that's undoubtedly true. The other thing I'd want to add to that, though, is something about this notion of a kind of an experimental approach, because I do think that's quite important. And by that I mean a sort of a kind of testing of the world in order to understand whether we've got solutions that are appropriate, rather than assuming that there are general purpose solutions that can be rolled out everywhere. And that seems, if we're going to be dealing with the kind of challenges that face us over the next century or so, then I assume we're going to be needing to generate different constellations of people and technology and space and time and all the rest of it in order to think about this kind of stuff. And simply repeating, the greatest hits of the past is not going to be a very helpful way of simulating the kind of imagination that we need in order to produce a future.
From all the interviews I've done for the book, excuse me, in response to the question, do you think there is a silver bullet for complex problems? There is a consistent answer, which is there's not a guaranteed answer, but the best you'll get is bringing together a set of diverse people with permission to ask any question and to inquire into anything. And then there's the possibility that together they might come up with something that they could try.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things, I mean, as I said at the start, my background's in sociology, and one of the strong streams of thought within organizational sociology at the moment is something called institutional theory. Institutional theory is partly an account of how people become routinized, how their thinking and their practices become shaped and sclerotic by the effect of working within a large organization. So we need to think about ways of preventing that from happening, because, organizations like prisons or something, they sculpt you, don't they? They produce you in particular kinds of ways. And I think if we're going to encourage more diverse and imaginative forms of thought, then we're going to need to work against that kind of sculpting. And the irony of this, of course, is that universities are certainly not exempt. We talk about universities as if they were kind of hotbeds of imagination and radicalism and the rest of it. Well, they're not. They're just as constraining, disciplinary in a whole series of ways as many of the organizations that they claim to be trying to help.
Which links back to Adrian's point about the education system, and it's not that 2% figure of people, of managers and organisations. It's not that they're not capable, but they've been taught not to think about paradox or to think about contradictions. So last thing before I put people into groups, one of the things that I think we run the risk of missing in this conversation and in your book is you do a really great job of pointing out that this is a particular phenomenon in the global north. You talk about the global north and the patterns within business schools there, and it raises for me some really interesting questions about intercultural differences, because the way in which we teach organising in business schools and in education is predominantly through a narrow set of assumptions. But I'm kind of wondering, what are the cultural differences here, and how does that relate to the School for Organising?
Yeah. That's a really interesting question, I think, isn't it? And the only honest answer is I don't know. It is clear to me that the curriculum of the global business school is an American one in terms of the definitions of particular disciplines and the assumptions about capital and individual freedoms and big organizations. I've had lots of conversations with people from different parts of the globe who talk about the ways in which, say, I don't know, South African business systems might be different, or Brazilian business systems might be different, and so on. But the way that the business school represents those is primarily, here's how capitalism works in Brazil, or here's how capitalism works in South Africa. Yeah. Now, I assume if my ideas about sort of diversity and experimentalism are worth anything, that what might well happen is that we get the development of very different assumptions about how you do organization and exchange in different parts of the world. But I couldn't say in advance what those might look like. Yeah, I mean, just that they will be different, just as languages are different and foods are different, that human beings develop sets of different ways of understanding themselves and each other. So why should the same not be true of business organizations? That seems, a fairly obvious thing to say, doesn't it? And I was just thinking yesterday, I was asked to examine a PhD at Lancaster University, and it looks like, just looking at the abstract, that's the kind of the beginnings of a notion of a maybe it's more established than that, I don't know, of a particular kind of an Indian ethics of organizing, which I assume is going to be related to Hinduism in some way, but is a kind of distinct feature of Indian business culture or something like that. And that does sound really interesting, but I kind of assume that that's a necessary corollary of my arguments, that you get different forms emerging in different places.
Lovely. So we are going to change gear. Me and Martin have been chuntering away for long enough. We've talked about the School for Organising, and now I'm going to put you into small groups. Hopefully it works out. There's going to be 2 or 3 of you. In fact, I'll just make it slightly bigger. There's going to be 3 or 4 of you in groups. And there's just some questions to get you going. Go where you want. I would be particularly interested if I, in that fourth one. What assumptions are you becoming more aware of? I've been challenged in the last year and a half about my own assumptions, and when I talk to something like Martin, I notice my own assumptions rolling around, and some are confirmed and some are not. So have a conversation. I'll give you roughly 20 minutes, and when we come back, we'll have another kind of Q&A stroke plenary before we finish for the day, and we're finishing bang on 12:30. So rooms are opening now. Martin, you have got an invite to a room, but it's up to you whether you join or whether you want to just hang with me.
I will join a room, but I just need to go for a wee first. Because
So
I'm an old man.
Martin will arrive in room 3 shortly.
All right.
Okay.
See you, room 3.
Thanks and welcome back. So we are going to have a final Q&A and plenary. Be good to hear back from a few of you in terms of what emerged from the conversations and the other questions you have for Martin. Who would like to start?
I really don't want to hog the conversation, but I've been so stimulated by everything that we've been talking about. I just had a question. It was how we ended our conversation in our group around, we talk about systems, but what about business magazines, like the Harvard Business Review or the papers that the McKinsey's put out? Like, these are hugely influential, and leaders flock to these things for their ideas. If you think systemically, how do we include these kinds of, I guess, propaganda in the shifts that we're trying to make to be more radical in our thinking?
I think that's a really interesting thing, isn't it? Because I think you're right in saying it's not just about what business schools teach. Yeah, and in a sense, that's been my focus. But at the same time, there's a kind of whole complex of media and consultancy and products that are also being sold as if they were, to use Steve's term, silver bullets. And that's been the case for a very long time. I suppose Tom Peters was probably the first one who was kind of monetizing the idea of the magic silver bullet. But Peters was very clever about doing it, because at the same time as he was kind of trying to sell you the silver bullet, he was also in later iterations saying there is no silver bullet. It's kind of like the silver bullet is that there is no etc., that kind of stuff. So that sort of almost kind of snake oil salesperson status of those gurus is something that I think really needs to be questioned. I was something I'm involved in at work, and one of the very senior managers at the university was quoting "good to great." Is it Jim Porras? Is that his name?
Jim Collins.
Okay. Collins, yeah, and was kind of pulling some just nonsense out of that, in kind of an Aesop's fable kind of way, as if it meant something, as if it was a kind of the proof of something. I try not to. I bite my lip at those points.
Other reflections.
I'd propose a different view, which is, like most media, all media has an agenda. And if you look at the advertising revenue and who contributes to that, then I'm concerned that Harvard Business Review is actually peddling the agenda of big business. I actually don't believe there's that symbiotic relationship, and I think it won't be broken necessarily, and therefore it's creating something over here that attracts more attention and leadership. You look at the role, you look at the politics and the dynamics that sit behind the development of emotional intelligence as a thing, and there's quite an agenda that sits behind that. So I just challenge it and say, I know everyone flocks, but do you really want them in the room? I'm not sure you do. I challenge that and say, if you're going to make something different, as I said in our group, there's an expression I was introduced to, which is a sunflower doesn't chase bees. Therefore, you've just got to become a better sunflower than the other things that bees are not currently attracted to in order to do that. Now that takes work, but it also requires collaboration, and it only requires a small group of people to agree that that's worth doing. I'll shut up now.
I guess there's something here about the kind of the universalization of particular problems and solutions, isn't there, as well? So going back to the idea of the silver bullet, I assume that the idea of the silver bullet is that it works the same way everywhere. But if we kind of relativize that and insist on the importance of context and so on, then there might be lots of different silver bullets that do lots of different kinds of things, in which case the metaphor of the silver bullet no longer becomes particularly useful. But I suppose the other part of this is necessary. It's necessary, I think, to insert politics into it. And as Paul was indicating, I think HBR, Harvard Business Review, clearly has a political agenda. It's basically pushing a Chicago school version of capitalism. It does that highly profitably, and it presents it with the gloss of Harvard University, supposedly best university in the world and so on. But it is nonetheless an ideological tool. The problem for me is as soon as I start talking about ideology and politics, then people put me in the Marxist box. Yeah. And so that becomes a kind of a tricky form of language to use, in a sense. That's underneath all of my thinking and action is that we need to politicize these kinds of things. But it's difficult to name it because it then boxes you in ways that aren't very helpful.
It's interesting. There was a McKinsey email that came into my inbox this morning to what is a very useful article about how the more you involve people in change and transformation organisations, the more positive the impact is. But the metric they chose was the increase to shareholder value.
Right. Okay.
That's what they led with. And there was tons of it in the article where I read it and I thought, no, I'm with you. I think that's great and I'm supportive. It's inclusive. But it led on the increase in shareholder value.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, one of the things I argue in the book is that, if you like, the dominant model that gets taught in business schools is the corporation, and consequently the idea that the shareholder is if you like, the only important stakeholder is very often embedded into assumption, particularly in finance courses, and that's such a damaging way of thinking, isn't it? Even a kind of rudimentary glance at ideas from stakeholder theory would suggest that you need to be rather more generous in the way that you think about the who benefits and who disbenefits from various forms of organising.
We had John, you posted something there. Interesting question. Where should we speak from to be heard? That's an interesting question.
Yeah, so I suppose it was just sort of prompted by a conversation we were having, and that kind of, in terms of how should you. So Martin's speaking from here, right? And then I suppose that prompted the idea, well, who needs to listen in order to kind of get traction in this? And then that prompted the question of, well, how should we then speak? I mean, what kind of language should we kind of use to try, because perhaps this language that we're using at the minute isn't cutting through. Does that make sense? I mean, we were kind of talking Adrian was talking about other ways of being, other ways of organizing, other ways of from his experiences. I mean, one quick statement I had from a colleague in an argument we were in a couple of months ago, actually, and it was with an American and a French guy, and it basically came down to this, and the French guy said, look, you and I have a very different idea of what organizations are about. The Americans think that it's about making money, whereas we think it's about constructing meaningful work. And that's a very different perspective of what the business is for, as what you're getting to, I suppose. But then that's also speaking in a different way, it's speaking about different terms, isn't it? Right?
Yeah, that's right. I think, I mean, this is the question of politics, isn't it? I mean, assuming that that many of the people on this call, think that we need to change, then who do we need to persuade of what in order to make those changes happen? And many of the ideas, I mean, say if we're talking about let me pick a fairly pragmatic example, co-ops, for example. Yeah, I think the co-op is a really important and relevant business form, and that we need a series of changes in basically legal and financial incentives in order to make co-ops easier to set up, to make it easier for them to get finance, and easier for them to organize their internal affairs. So forms of accounting, basically, that allow co-ops to exist rather in a less more friction-free way. But that requires talking to policymakers. It requires that people at Department of Trade and Industry or wherever are persuaded that this is an area that needs some kind of attention in order to make that happen. And whenever I've engaged in those kinds of conversations, and I've done sometimes trying to persuade policymakers that things should change, of course, you're immediately into who benefits and who doesn't from these kinds of conversations. And many policymakers don't they are as driven by immediate concerns of the next election or the particular problems with budgets in one department or another. So often you're not landing your arguments in useful places that will generate change.
Other thoughts, reflections from your conversations?
And something which struck me is the people who complete a business program, and as and when we see in many organizations, they create a barrier of entry, and that creates a niche thought process in which, have this person completed a business course to understand, and actually that prevents other form of thought coming in, and that also creates, if he is from this business school, he may be in this pay bracket, so it creates bias knowingly or unknowingly, and sometimes it is knowingly creating a bias, so that entry barriers are bigger and bigger each year. So that is one aspect. And if we see the way in which, as Steve mentioned, the Frederick Taylor, when he brought the concept of productivity and enhancing the shareholder value over a period of time, and we are teaching the same thing again and again, that is schooling, and how we schooled creates our condition. And the work of PR, the public relations or media agencies, projecting the image in Financial Times or and any other space, the way in which branding is done by business school is much higher than any other schools across universities. So, and again, if we observe the way in which corporations squeeze out public money. So I just follow a person called Dan Price, who has a company called Gravity Payments, and his tweets. And it says that, there is shareholders are doing buyback of their shares during the pandemic and making much more profit, and they are laying off employees once they receive the government aid.
So it's all connected.
It's all connected.
Yeah. I wouldn't want, and I think I said this, I wouldn't want you to think that I imagined that changing business schools will result in everything changing. I think they are part of a system that reproduces a set of assumptions about organization and exchange. And changing them will be a valuable thing to do if we can find a way of doing it. But of course, there are so many other centers of power that are still benefiting from the way this system, our system currently works. There was a very interesting program on the radio yesterday about Elon Musk and this idea of a new form of capitalism that she was calling Muskism. I don't know if anybody heard this. It's like a kind of science fiction capitalism. And of course, Musk is now, I think, is he the wealthiest person in the world now? Or is it still Bezos? I don't know. Anyway, we're now in a system in which the inequalities between ordinary people and ordinary people globally, and these people is probably greater than it's ever been. I think even during the Gilded Age, I don't think that people are worth as much as some of these tech billionaires are. And of course, they have their interests.
John, you got your hand waving.
Oh yes, I tried to, and it seems to work. Yeah, so thanks. I just
John.
Hi Martin. So yeah, really interesting discussion. But just reflecting on whether you think Schools for Organising could effectively spring up in parallel to existing business schools,
Mm.
you sort of set them up as things which would necessarily involve shutting down business schools. Do you think they could grow up as well as, and then sort of gradually take over, or at least have their niche? And I'm just wondering as well that whether this might depend a bit on, the very first thing you said was the premise to all this is capitalism is broken.
Mm.
And I'm sort of wondering how uncompromising you would want to be about that statement, and how you would, I don't know, how severely you would define the word broken, because others might say that the more broken you want to argue, the more you might exclude from listening further, if you see what I mean. Others might say, yes, there are things which aren't working, but it's not completely broken. And that might constitute quite a big constituency of current traditional business schools. So if you're willing to compromise on that, there might be more of a kind of radical change from within possible. But if you're really uncompromising, setting something up that's a radical alternative to School for Organising might be more in order. I just wondered if you reflected on that those kind of possible futures, if you I'm sure you have. But.
Well, yeah, as you know, I and John work together, so that we've had conversations about this kind of stuff, and I'm terribly torn about it, John. I mean, on the one hand, I think that something genuinely radical probably needs to exist outside current business school structures, business school and university structures. As you and I very well know, there's a kind of a series of financial and frankly, ideological imperatives that push university schools to particular kinds of configuration. So if you really want to do something different, it's probably got to be outside the university system right now. At the same time, I'm kind of pragmatic. I'd rather see at least some changes taking place within some schools. So it was interesting, for example, that the University of York in the UK very recently announced that it was merging its relatively small school of management and its, I think it's its social policy department into a school of management and society, or school of business and society, or something like that. Which I thought was really interesting. That's a fascinating configuration, and it kind of assumes, I suppose, its founding claim, if you like, is that the market is not the only game in town. That this is necessarily going to be a series of engagements with the state and particular sort of senses of value, which inform the way we understand things like the National Health Service and social care and all the rest of it. So that seems to me quite a radical moment, something that can happen within the university. I'll be very interested to see how that develops, and whether the Vice Chancellor of the University of York then, realizes that his business school isn't earning as much as the business school at the University of Warwick, and consequently he wants it to become more mainstream. I don't know.
So that's brilliant. We're going to have to finish there shortly. I just want to bring us back to our first question, invite you to go back to Menti. And let's see, Martin, whether or not our conversation and your conversations with each other have changed people's views.
Yeah.
That'd
be interesting. This is the school debate bit. See whether I've won.
Yeah.
Was it what did it end up? It was about 7 undecided.
It was 7 undecided, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, 1 undecided. Oh no. Oh, okay. As they're coming in. Oh, people are going to stay undecided. Damn you.
I can't appear to vote, Martin, but if I could, I would shut them down long ago.
Thank you very much. Hannah, you're down as Hannah, which is can't hear you. Can't hear you, Hannah. Right.
So,
yes.
It's just Rachel's going to say, I clicked no by mistake. I meant yes.
But I haven't got Mentimeter on, so you can add me to 5. I'll take that to 6.
Okay. So we're actually at
I'll
7.
take that to 7.
Okay.
Up to 7.
All right. Good. That's it then. We'll close them down, shall we?
Yeah.
That's marvelous. So I will just move this on, and I'm just going to leave this up as one final thing, if you feel moved to. In your own view, in a nutshell, what needs to change? And I've left that deliberately open because, it might be something outside business schools. So just as a final reflective question, what needs to change? And if you feel moved to add something as a closing thought, then feel free. And as you do that, I'm simply going to say thank you immensely to Martin for your
That's pleasure.
time and your generosity of thought, and for wearing as loud a shirt as me, so I don't feel as alone. And to you all for coming. I will make the recording available as soon as I have a chance to edit it. It will be on the YouTube channel, it will also be on my LinkedIn feed, but you will all get an email with details of it in. And I will be putting in that a link to Martin's book as well. So those of you who are interested in reading more, I will make that easy for you to be able to get to. So
terrific.
One and all.
Yeah. Could I just say thank you very much as well? Thanks very much for listening. You've been it sounds like a crap band, but you've been a great audience.
I'm also going to, if you're still typing, I'll just close the share now, but that Mentimeter thing is open. And if you want to add your thoughts, I'll share that as a download with the information I send out. There is a newsletter as well to the book project, which I will put the link to in the email. And there are going to be 1 or 2 more webinars in the next few months. So keep your eyes peeled. So thanks once again. We're bang on 12:30. Yes. Job done. Until next time. See you all.
Thanks very much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. And goodbye. I need to find a way of leaving now.